Hello, welcome to the American Evolution. This is part 2, the lecture on America under the Articles of Confederation. Now, as I mentioned before, the Articles of Confederation created a very weak government here in the United States, and so as a result, it really caused a lot of problems with foreign affairs, right? For example, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 had guaranteed rights to the loyalists. Loyalists who had remained loyal to the king during the war said in the treaty that you have to treat them fairly. You have to give them their land back, for example, if you confiscated it. Well, in many of these states, this won't happen. And if you have a state that doesn't do that, doesn't agree with that aspect of the Treaty of Paris, what are you going to do about it as the federal government? Well, there's nothing you can do. There's no way for you to enforce the fact that they're infringing upon these rights. The British, realizing this, will keep troops in the western lands well after the war is over. And they actually won't be removed in its entirety until after the signing of Jay's Treaty. The British also had a long history of the impressment of sailors into the Royal Navy. Whenever they needed more sailors, they would tend to board other ships and impress people into the Navy. This is going to become really, really prevalent during the Napoleonic Wars, right? Well, American ships were great targets for that. Why? Well, American sailors spoke English. That made it a lot easier for them to integrate into the Royal Navy. And so impressment would begin on a large scale. What's the United States going to do about that? Well, they don't have a navy to speak of, so there's not a whole lot they can do. Spain and access to the Mississippi River. Now, the Treaty of Paris granted land to the United States all the way to the east bank of the Mississippi River, but didn't include the river itself. The river belonged to Spain, and the treaty stated that Spain would grant free access to the Mississippi River and also the use of the city of New Orleans as a trade hub. However, Spain became very concerned that that would cause rampant settlement of Americans there on that east bank of the Mississippi River, and thus put their eastern boundary at risk. Remember, at this time they still owned Louisiana territory. And so in 1784, Spain is going to close American access to the Mississippi River. Okay? And on top of that, there's also going to be a dispute between the United States and Spain over where the northern boundary of western Florida was, that currently the panhandle of Florida today, right? When the British took possession of Spanish Florida, they established the northern boundary of western Florida, north about to where modern-day Vicksburg, Mississippi is. Spain, of course, now that they have Florida back, wants that to be the recognized boundary. Of course, the United States refuses to recognize it. They say, no, it's the original boundary that it was back in 1763 when the British first took possession of it. And then finally, negotiating treaties. I mean, let's think about it. Who do you negotiate treaties with? There's no executive to negotiate a treaty with, so you can't talk to them. Are you going to talk to the entirety of that legislative body under the Articles of Confederation, or do you deal with the individual states? Foreign nations looked at the United States, and what they saw was 13 weak, disunited states, right? Great Britain will refer to the United States as the Great American Experiment. And when the Civil War breaks out in 1861, the British newspapers and stuff will all chime into the fact that that great American experiment had indeed failed. Now, that being said, there were some successes under the Articles of Confederation. For example, well, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 itself, right? That was negotiated and signed while we were under the governance of the Articles of Confederation. It hadn't been ratified in 1781, rather. There was the establishment of the individual state governments. Most of the individual state constitutions were ratified under the Articles of Confederation, right? There was the passage of the Northwest Ordinances, something I'll go into more detail here in a minute, that established the baseline for additional states to be added to the Union. And then, of course, probably most importantly, under the Articles of Confederation, they will develop the document that will replace it, the United States Constitution. But let's get back to the Northwest Ordinances for a minute here. Northwest Ordinances were passed in 1784, 1785, and 1787. some multiple of ordinances that set up the pattern for Western expansion and settlement. What had happened was basically this. The moment that the boundary was established at east bank of the Mississippi River, Virginia's first response to that was to lay claim to that entire Ohio River Valley that they've been coveting ever since, well, the start of the 7 Years' War. Right? Now, of course, the northeastern states are not going to have that. They're not going to allow Virginia to become some kind of super state. And so a deal was cut, if you will. The southern states were allowed to extend their borders all the way to the Mississippi River. That's why if you take a look at this map here, you'll see that Virginia includes all of modern-day Kentucky as well, and North Carolina includes all of modern-day Tennessee. South Carolina even will extend a border all the way to the Mississippi River, will make it look like it has a panhandle hundreds of miles long, make it look like a giant ladle, right? And Georgia will as well, okay? The Northwest Territory, it's very difficult for these northeastern states to do this, so they came up with a plan to break this up ultimately into 5 separate states. They established the plan then for the establishment of these new states. First of all, the states were to be surveyed, the land would be, sectioned off, and then you could apply for admission into the Union once your population reached 60,000. You had to allow freedom of worship. There had to be freedom of religion in these new territories. You had to set aside land for public schools. Matter of fact, the Northwest Ordinances is what's going to begin the precedent of a free public school system that most of you here grew up in. Opinions on this may vary on whether that was good or not, but it is what it is. This is the origins of it. Trial by jury, including in civil cases. And finally, no slavery, which is actually kind of a shocking little addition to this. No slavery in these northern territories. You already see some of this sectional divide between the North and the South being firmly established. The South didn't fight this too hard because they were allowed to extend their borders all the way to the Mississippi River. And of course, slavery is going to be allowed in these areas where they extended their borders to. Ultimately, though, you have rampant instability under the Articles of Confederation. You can't tax, right? So you can't have a navy. So what little navy the United States had, they sold it. The Army, you can't pay for the soldiers. The United States Army was reduced to 80 men. Artillerymen and officers, that was pretty much it. You had a group of guys that can shoot a cannon and a group of guys that can tell them what to shoot the cannon at. They couldn't pay their debts. How are you going to pay your debts if you can't tax? The only way you can raise any revenue is through the sale of land, right? But you can't pay any of these debts. The country itself will find itself on the edge of economic collapse. The states had debts of their own, right? The states had money that they had loaned, well, honestly, mostly to the federal government. The federal government, under the Continental Congress and under the Articles of Confederation, had not just borrowed money from France and the Dutch and elsewhere, but had borrowed money from the individual states. They can't pay this debt back. So now the states are straddled with this debt. The states are issuing paper money, but this paper money is becoming very quickly worthless. For example, in Massachusetts, the paper money issued there is going to depreciate during the war, in the first year that it was issued, to 1/4 of its value, and by the end of the war, it had reached 1/40th of its face value. So you have crushing inflation and interstate trade wars. States are charging tariffs on each other. Remember, they see themselves as individual little nations. And in the West, you also have Indian affairs. You have these areas that you're now moving into, but there's Native Americans already there, and there's that potentiality for conflict, the kind of thing that worried George III that led to the proclamation of 1763, right? But how are you going to deal with that? You're going to send those 80 guys, the U.S. Army, to take care of it? What you have here is a case where you have too much liberty and not enough security. And there's going to be an incident that's going to open everybody's eyes to that and make them rethink how they have this set up in an incident known as Shays' Rebellion. But that's for the next lecture.